People born at the tail end of the 19th century had an objectively crazy life. They were born in the Victorian era, they came of age during the First World War, they witnessed the Second World War and the Civil Rights Movement, and many of them would have lived long enough to hear disco. They were born into a world of horse-drawn carriages, and many of them got to see man landing on the moon. Theirs was a generation that seemed to span some of history's greatest accomplishments and most terrifying changes. They're a generation that shaped the world that we know in innumerable ways, and yet Gertrude Stein coined them the Lost Generation. This is a term that holds multiple meanings. It is, in part, a reference to the many souls lost during the First World War. In Britain, 1 out of every 8 men mobilized for the war effort was killed, many of them under the age of 20. Their lives ended before they ever had the chance to start. And yet, Gertrude Stein wasn't calling the ghosts of the Western Front lost. She was describing those who had survived. It's said that the things that shape a generation are what happened to them roughly between the ages of 17 and 25. And for the Lost Generation, that was the brutal death of millions of their peers in a conflict that would only go on to seed further violence. Forced through the crucible of global war, dragged behind the vehicle of change, and torn apart under the microscope of public opinion, the Lost Generation endured experiences that were incredibly unique. And from these unique experiences, they were able to produce masterful art, especially in the realm of literature. In a world ill-equipped to acknowledge, much less heal, the trauma of war, literature became the avenue through which many people confronted the demons of the past, the fears of the future, and the inexplicable feelings that bound them together in the present. Now, alas, not every video can be about everything, so I have chosen 3 authors that I think are emblematic of the Lost Generation's literature, to try and learn a little bit more about this generation that may be lost, but whose voices are still very relevant today. Now, just a warning, I am going to be spoiling things from all 3 of these pieces of media, but frankly, if you're on this channel and you need a spoiler warning for The Lord of the Rings, I don't know how to help you. But I do know how to help you learn about coding using this video's sponsor, boot.dev. I have always said that I think of technology as a kind of magic, like the incomprehensible sort of thing that a wizard would use. And I usually say that because I'm very, very bad at this technological magic, but thanks to this video's sponsor, boot.dev, this magic is becoming more and more comprehensible to me. Boot.dev uses a hands-on RPG-like experience to help you learn everything that you need to know about software development. You can learn back-end web development from start to finish in Python, SQL, and Go, and you get to learn by doing what you'd actually do at a job, by building real projects. Boot.dev makes learning coding feel just like a game, and it's simple and easy enough to follow that even someone as tech illiterate as me is able to learn something. Not to mention, they have a Discord community with tons of real humans to help you out if you ever get stuck on something. Now, all of their content is free to read and watch, but a paid membership unlocks features like hands-on coding, progress tracking, and game mechanics, so what are you waiting for? They even have a 30-day no questions asked refund policy, and a free demo of the interactive experience on every course. Go to the link in my description, or go to boot.dev and use my code JessofTheShire to get 25% off your entire first year on the annual plan. Thank you so much to boot.dev for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors when I have them. The concept of a generation as a collective group of people born in a certain time range really only started taking shape in the 20th century. Before this point, generations were thought of familially, on a genealogical level, your parents' generation versus your generation. But as global communication began to give people a more immediate look at the history happening all around them, this concept of a globally united age group began to emerge. And there are 2 perspectives that make up the identity of a generation. First off, there is identity from within, so basically what a generation thinks of itself based off of its experiences. And then there is identity from the outside, the way that a generation is characterized by the people who are not in it. And these two perceptions are often both in conflict and in conversation. I'm sure we've all noticed how every generation, eventually, boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, comes under popular fire. And I'm also sure that you believe that whatever generation you are a part of is actually way different to what other people think that it is. But this dual-pronged formation of generational identity means that in the case of the Lost Generation, many writers weren't just writing to their peers, they were trying to capture the particularly ineffable qualities of their life experiences in a way that people from the outside could also understand. War has been around as long as people have, but the particular cocktail that the Lost Generation was served, this combination of timing, of technology, and the sheer brutality, left the Lost Generation isolated in its experiences and trying to desperately communicate why they were the way that they were. And many authors found that the best way to do this was through stories. It has been well documented that stories are a great way of processing things, especially trauma. When it comes to memories, trauma is generally written into the brain on an unconscious level. It's something kind of like knowing how to ride a bike. You don't consciously remember knowing how to ride a bike. It's not a memory that you intentionally recall or contemplate. It's just a button that gets pressed in your subconscious when you get on a bike and start to ride. Now, in the case of trauma, this unconscious memory can be troublesome because anything can be a trigger, and these unconscious recollections can have a devastating emotional impact. But by telling a story around a traumatic event, you are consciously bringing it to the surface. It allows you to assign meaning to the trauma, to begin to control your emotional responses around that story. Since repression is a pretty ineffective coping method, developing traumatic events into a story can be a very useful way of processing these troubling unconscious memories. You are taking the unconscious and making it conscious. That's why, for many veterans, telling war stories is a deeply personal and important part of healing. It's no surprise, then, that for the Lost Generation, war stories became very popular. But there was one that started it all, Erich Maria Remarque's Im Westen nichts Neues, or All Quiet on the Western Front. Remarque was born in Germany in 1898, and he grew up skilled in all of the arts, from literature to music. However, his plans of becoming a teacher were derailed by the start of the war. At 18 years of age, Remarque was conscripted into the German army and sent to the Western Front. The records of what exactly happened to Remarque during his service are contested, but he was injured at least once, and based off of his writings, he saw what it was that the front had in store for the men of his generation. All Quiet on the Western Front is a semi-autobiographical account of a German soldier's experience in the war. This young man, Paul Baumer, recounts how he and his schoolmates were raring for war when the call came. Their teachers had set them alight with tales of old-world heroism, of glory on the battlefield, and they charged to the front, desperate to make men of themselves. But these delusions were shattered the moment that they arrived on the front. This was not the old world, and this was not its war. This was death on a mechanized, industrial scale, and all hope of heroism was scoured out of these hopeful schoolboys in mere days. Paul describes, "We have been consumed by the fires of reality. We might be present in the world, but would we be alive in it? We are like children who have been abandoned, and we are as experienced as old men. We are coarse, unhappy, and superficial. I think that we are lost." The story comes to us in the form of scattered recollections, like pages of a diary tossed into the air and hastily reassembled. Characters come and go, page by page, appearing, dying, and re-emerging as a ghost of a memory. Battles and locations are given no clear distinction, and the story is broken into endlessly repeating patterns, staccato beats of struggle, recovery, and struggle again. And in the breaths between the pain, Paul comes to realize just how deeply he and his peers were betrayed by the old stories. This was not war, this was not battle. This was survival. The only thing that Paul has to hang on to is the fact that he is not alone. His peers are beside him, and even if the rest of the world would never understand, his peers would. Only they would be able to understand what it means to be a teenager sent to the slaughter. We hadn't had a chance to put down any roots. The war swept us away. For others, for the older men, war is an interruption, and they can think beyond the end of it. But we were caught up in the war, and we can't see how things will turn out. All we know for the moment is that in some strange and melancholy way, we have become hardened, although we don't often feel sad about it anymore. They find that there isn't time to feel sad, there isn't time to feel much of anything at all. Paul says that all of these huge feelings must be put off, that if you try to come to terms with what it is that you've seen and what it is that you've done, you will die. Many of these soldiers are putting off these feelings in the hopes that they will die, and that they'll never have to pay their dues. In one scene, Paul stabs an enemy soldier and finds himself trapped in a shell hole with him as he slowly bleeds out. Hatred born of fear sours into regret. Paul says, "Why don't they keep on reminding us that you are all miserable wretches just like us, and that your mothers worried themselves just as much as ours, and that we are all just as scared of death, and that we die in the same way and feel the same pain? Forgive me, comrade. How could you be my enemy? If we threw these uniforms and weapons away, you could be just as much my brother as Kat and Albert. Take 20 years from my life, comrade, and get up again. Take more, because I don't know what I'm going to do with the years I've got." But the horror doesn't end on the front. Midway through the novel, Paul is sent home for leave, and Remarque completely overturns our expectations for what that'll look like. For Paul, this homecoming doesn't feel like rest or recovery or peace. In order to survive, he has become an animal, and he quickly realizes that there is no room for an animal like him in civilized society. People want to talk about the war, but they don't want to hear about his perspective. One man that he speaks to, in fact, insists that soldiers like Paul have no real understanding of what's happening on the battlefield at all. Paul returns to the front shaken, realizing that there may not be a home for him to return to. Not for him, and not for anyone. I am young. I am 20 years of age, but I know nothing of life except despair, death, fear, and the combination of completely mindless superficiality with an abyss of suffering. I see people being driven against one another and silently, uncomprehendingly, foolishly, obediently, and innocently killing one another. I see the best brains in the world inventing weapons and words to make the whole process that much more sophisticated and long-lasting. And watching this with me are my contemporaries, here and on the other side, all over the world. My whole generation is experiencing this with me. What would our fathers do if one day we rose up and confronted them and called them to account? What do they expect from us when a time comes in which there is no war? For years, our occupation has been killing. That was the first experience we had. Our knowledge of life is limited to death. What will happen afterwards? And what can possibly become of us? For Paul and his contemporaries, the old world is dead. They have had to harden themselves, to demean themselves, to forget everything that they knew, and yet they find that the real horror is the prospect of the war ever really ending. The real horror is finally being allowed to take in that breath, whereupon the wave that has been rising over them will finally crash down. The real horror is what might come after the war. Paul never has to face this reality. He and nearly every one of his comrades are picked off, and in the end, Paul falls on the battlefield, and his loss is so inconsequential, it is so irrelevant, that it is reported on that day, Im Westen sie nichts Neues zu melden. There is no news from the West. This is one of the parts of this book that has been somewhat muddled by the fact of translation. The original English translation had the title of this book reading All Quiet on the Western Front, whereas the original German literally translates closer to No News from the West. And while effectively these two phrases do mean the same thing, I find that the implications are rather different. The contrast of noise and quiet are actually a very important aspect of this book. There's a point in the story where Paul bemoans how it is never quiet on the front. Even in the so-called quiet moments, there is an inescapable din. There is always noise. And I think that it is of utmost importance that upon Paul's death, it was not all quiet, but rather the noise of his cries were so overwhelmed by the roar of war all around him that there was simply no news to be reported upon his passing. Remarque shows us this brilliant spark of a character. He's so cutting in his observations. He's tragically wise and piercingly human. And yet when this life is snuffed out, it is utterly unremarkable in the face of the war's volume. The novel begins with a note from Remarque that reads, "This book is intended neither as an accusation nor as a confession, but simply as an attempt to give an account of a generation that was destroyed by the war, even those of it who survived the shelling." This novel is not trying to capture a literal truth. It is not an autobiography, it is not a history. It is, rather, an account of a generation, and in killing his protagonist, in refusing to show how Paul might move forward, how he might reintegrate, how he might face all that he has seen, Remarque leaves the audience in the same horrifying suspense that he and so many other survivors found themselves hanging. And whatever moment it was that Remarque captured with this novel, it proved impactful. Im Westen nichts Neues sold some 600,000 copies within the first 3 months of its publication, and within its first year, it had been translated into 30 different languages. By 1930, a movie deal had been struck with Universal Pictures, and the film adaptation made just as much of an impact. The novel sparked a boom in war literature, feeding an audience of people hungry for authentic-seeming war stories. The processing of grief that Remarque underwent through All Quiet on the Western Front became the platform upon which the world began coming to terms with what it is that they had done. But not everyone was so happy about the novel's success. Especially in Germany, Remarque's own country, All Quiet on the Western Front was seen as a negative portrayal of the German war effort. His anti-war messaging was not the sentiment of all survivors of the war, and in Germany, many soldiers stayed on or rejoined the war effort following armistice. Thus, Remarque's condemnation of their efforts was not well regarded. All Quiet on the Western Front became a particular target of the rising Nazi movement, to the point where it was one of the books that was burned and banned. Joseph Goebbels himself led the effort to sabotage the German premiere of the film with mice and stink bombs. Remarque was accused of being secretly Jewish and was forced to flee his home country for his own safety. The strong reactions both in favor and against Remarque's work make it clear that his novel had captured the breath of the moment. Perhaps it did not encapsulate the war exactly on a minute factual level, but it did something much more important. It captured the way that an entire generation felt about the war in incredibly arresting detail. The past had died. The promises of youth had collapsed. As Remarque succinctly put, "We were 18 years old, and we had just begun to love the world, and to love being in it. But we had to shoot at it. The first shell to land went straight for our hearts. In other literature of the Lost Generation, the war is not the centerpiece, but rather the starting gun for their generation's despondency, and Ernest Hemingway is kind of the king of this. Hemingway was an American born in 1899, and by the time America joined in the war effort, he, like so many others his age, was itching to join the fight. He was turned away from army service due to poor eyesight, but he persisted in his efforts to help, signing on as a volunteer ambulance driver. He arrived on the front in 1918, where just barely a month into service, he was wounded badly by mortar fire. Despite his injuries, Hemingway carried a wounded soldier to safety, becoming further injured by machine gun fire in the process. For his efforts, Hemingway was granted an Italian Silver Medal of Valor. Hemingway spent 6 months in a war hospital recovering, but by the time he returned to America, his visions of war as a grand adventure had been thoroughly shattered. Hemingway struggled to adapt to home life, he became a reporter, and eventually he moved to Paris to join the likes of Gertrude Stein and the other authors and artists heading the literature of the new era. Based somewhat on his life experiences following the war, in 1926 he published The Sun Also Rises. The working title of this book was actually The Lost Generation, and in its meandering, repetitive narrative, it shows all the ways in which he and his peers did seem utterly lost. Our narrator is Jake Barnes, a man who fought in the First World War and received an injury that left him unable to have sex. This injury colors everything for him. Jake has a relatively charmed life. He lives in Paris with a bunch of other expatriate veterans. He spends his day occasionally working as a reporter, but mostly just eating, drinking, dancing, and arguing in circles with his friends. But his wound is ever present in his mind and in other people's. His injury keeps him from being the romantic hero that tradition would dictate he would be. Jake becomes the embodiment of the unfulfilled desire that so characterizes these characters. He is the lost potential of even those that survived the battlefield. Jake's friends like to keep him around because he's good conversation, and also they think that he can't really be romantic competition, and the woman that he's in love with, Lady Brett Ashley, hangs on to him because he is the one romantic partner with whom she can never consummate the relationship and thus lose interest. These characters have nothing that they're living for, so to speak. They have multiple conversations that sound just like this one. "Listen, Jake," he leaned forward on the bar. "Don't you ever get the feeling that all your life is going by and you're not taking advantage of it? Do you realize you've lived nearly half the time you have to live already?" "Yes, every once in a while." "Do you know that in about 35 years more we'll be dead?" "What the hell, Robert," I said. "What the hell?" They are well aware of the fact that their lives are going by unlived, and yet they do nothing to fix this. It seems like there's nothing that will fix this. Brett and Jake have an argument that rather sums up their relationship, where Jake tries to steer her away from pursuing yet another futile romantic fling. She asks him, "Do you still love me, Jake?" "Yes," I said. "Because I'm a goner," Brett said. "How?" "I'm a goner. I'm mad about the Romero boy. I'm in love with him, I think." "I wouldn't be if I were you." "I can't help it. I'm a goner. It's tearing me all up inside." "Don't do it." "I can't help it. I've never been able to help anything." "You ought to stop it." "How can I stop it? I can't stop things." During the war, these young people learned helplessness. They learned to become animals. They learned to close themselves off from the world and pretend at uncaring just to survive, just as Paul Baumer did in the trenches. They saved their emotions for later. But now, later has come, and they still feel like they simply cannot do anything about the way that things are. Robert Cohn would seem to be the one standout from the group. He, unlike the rest of them, never faced war. He has children. He is Jewish when the rest of them are not. He is a published novelist. He's educated and ambitious, and perhaps most importantly, in a world where everyone pretends not to care about anything, Cohn is the kind of person who wears his heart on his sleeve. Cohn is a representation of the way that things used to be in stories. He is a romantic hero, torn asunder by the storm of love. He has never faced the crucible of war that burned the romantic notions out of Jake and his fellow veterans. He's a mockery of what it is that they used to think that a man should be. Cohn falls in love loudly and often. He cries readily. He is a messy, heartbroken drunk, and the characters that embody the Lost Generation kind of hate him for being that way. They tolerate him to a point, but it becomes clear that he has no lasting place in their society beyond being an embarrassing footnote. That is not to say, of course, that Jake and his ilk are any less just cosmically embarrassing. But they have found companionship with each other, and even as they make each other miserable day in and day out, they find it much easier to stay in their echo chambers. Now, this is not, as was often said of the Lost Generation, simply laziness on their part. It is made crystal clear that this ambivalence was brought on by the lingering, unacknowledged shadow of war. The war has a pretty unsubtle place in this story, despite it taking place years later. They have arguments in a cafe called Versailles, just as the war concluded with messy peace talks in Versailles. Jake dates a prostitute named Georgette, who he assumes, apropos of nothing, is from Flanders, even though she's not. Operation Georgette was a German operation which took place in Flanders. When thinking up vacation destinations, Jake suggests the Shrine of St. Odile, which was a popular pilgrimage destination for disabled veterans after the war. Violence is a touchy and weird thing in this tale, because Jake and his friends do seek it out. They go on a group trip to Pamplona to see the running of the bulls, and yet, when seated at the bullfights, they cringe from it, and they shield Lady Brett's eyes from the bloodshed. Later on, they write off instances of violence as so sudden there wasn't time for it to bother anybody. Someone is gored by a bull and killed, and the locals describe to Jake a big horn wound. All for fun. Just for fun. What do you think of that? I don't know. That's it. All for fun. Fun, you understand. In the wake of war, the Lost Generation's perception of violence has been completely warped. They seek it out for fun, and yet when it's in front of them, they shield their eyes. They twist it. The real violence for them takes place on a psychological plane, and it is the violence that they wield against each other. The story comes to take on a kind of warlike pace. Jake, who is alone or sometimes standing with comrades, climbs a hill to a new battleground, like a cafe or a bar. He engages in combat, conversation, and he is wounded emotionally, typically by Lady Brett. Following his injury, Jake then retreats back to familiar territory, his hotel room or his bedroom, where he rests. But Hemingway is not condemning these characters as gluttons for punishment. They are neither fully victims, nor are they fully redeemed by the story. The reality simply was that they were unmoored by what they had endured. Hemingway said of his generation's troubles, "This is about something that is already finished. For whatever is going to happen to the generation of which I am a part has already happened. There will be more entanglements. There will be more complications. There will be successes and failures. There will be many new salvations brought forward. There may be another, better war. But none of it will particularly matter to this generation, because to them, the things that are given to people to happen have already happened." In the years following the war, the Lost Generation, especially those living overseas like Hemingway, they received a lot of critique. They were called lazy drunkards, wasting the life that they had been granted. And this novel does not shy away from that characterization. Hemingway's not afraid to make these characters unlikable. God knows, when I read this book in high school, I hated it. I hated all the characters and nothing happens. But, 10 years later, I can see that I think that's the point that Hemingway was making. These characters seem like they're putting on a performance because they are. Jake admits at one point, "It's awfully easy to be hard-boiled about everything in the daytime, but at night, it's another thing." The novel intentionally reveals the cracks in these facades, but it also forces us to contend with the fact that these are, at their heart, survival mechanisms that have run their course and lingered far longer than they should. This is the same learned coldness that saved people's lives during wartime. In war, you rest when you can, you drink when you can, you march into violence, and you flinch away when it confronts you, and you face the same terrible fights and arguments again and again and again because that's all that there is. In the kind of war that they had seen, you don't count on the future. You don't even really count on tomorrow. Today is all that you can hope for. This generation grew up into that fight, flight, and freeze mentality, and it is utterly unsurprising that just 10 years after the war had ended, they hadn't shaken off those instincts. The title of the novel derives from a line in the Bible's Book of Ecclesiastes that reads, "One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. The sun also ariseth, and the sun goeth down, and hasteneth to his place where he arose." In the context of the Bible, this passage evokes the eternity of God, and an overall hopeful idea that although the sun rises and sets, and humans live and die, the world persists, and it is slowly working towards redemption through the grace of God. Hemingway twists this concept to hammer home the pall of futility that hung over his generation in the years following the war. The sun also rises and sets for them, but what difference does it make? I think that Hemingway was acutely aware of how insufferable he and his peers could be. He was aware of how inconsequential they were allowing themselves to be. He was aware that they were wasting the time that they had left. But there's also a part of this story that can't help but feel like a cry for help. The novel ends with this exchange. "Oh, Jake," Brett said, "we could have had such a damned good time together." "Yes," I said. "Isn't it pretty to think so?" Despite what he seems to say, I think that Jake really does want things to be better than they are. I think he's just learned that they're not. Despite being very different types of stories, All Quiet on the Western Front and The Sun Also Rises share in a refusal of the old literary mode. Not only do they declare that the old stories have worn out their usefulness and that their platitudes have proven false, they also put the old mode firmly in its grave by their mere style. Both of these novels take advantage of a very stripped-back style of prose, motivated clearly by the type of story that they're telling. For Remarque, this simplicity is born out of desperation. The economy of life that Paul and his companions are forced into for survival is reflected in the prose. Words are chosen with biting precision, just as every footstep must be carefully chosen if one is to avoid slipping into the mud of the trenches. You simply haven't the breath remaining for extraneous language. Hemingway's sparse prose is caged in by the same kind of tight-lipped pride that fuels his characters. Jake would never let himself slip off into fantasy, and so Hemingway keeps his stories achingly, bleakly real. Both of these authors are saying that the lost generation hasn't time for the luxury of metaphor. These are books fueled by irony. They are making lofty philosophical claims about something as vague as a generation. They touch on things as tremulous as the nature of evil, but the stories that they are telling are so deeply real and grounded in literal circumstances, in very tangible things. This contrast of philosophical concepts, realized by very sparse prose and literal stories, was hugely effective in communicating their feelings. But despite the popularity of this ironic tone, there were Lost Generation authors who took, let's just say, a different approach. J.R.R. Tolkien is the oldest of the authors I've chosen to cover here. He was born in South Africa in 1892, and he grew up in the English countryside. And from a very young age, Tolkien was an imaginative, nostalgic child, and he found escape in the literature of the Old World. But this love for the heroic epics did not propel him eagerly into the face of war. Tolkien waited as long as he possibly could to join up, but by 1916 he was sent off to France as a signaller. There, he fought in the Battle of the Somme and remained in the trenches until the end of October, when he came down with trench fever and was shipped home to recover. It was in the trenches and during his extended recovery period that Tolkien began penning the languages and worlds that would become his Middle-earth. Now, The Lord of the Rings is explicitly not allegorical. Frodo is not Tolkien or any of his friends, the ring is not the nuclear bomb, and the War of the Ring is not meant to be the First World War, much less the Second. But I do think that The Lord of the Rings, intentionally or not, contains many concepts that align with the experiences of the Lost Generation far too closely for it to be mere happenstance. In many ways, Middle-earth is quite parallel to turn-of-the-century Western Europe. Just as the Industrial Revolution had heralded in a new era, so the elves and the magic of the Old World are giving way to the Age of Men. But Tolkien made very clear distinctions in his story between healthy progress and reckless societal progress. Progress like that of the rise of mankind, the slow fade of the Ents, or the gradual advancements of Hobbit culture was to be accepted. This change was mindful, careful, and it came with a respect for that which came before it. However, the ruthless progress of someone like Saruman, tearing apart the natural world for his own benefit, burning up the old ways in the fires of industrialization, was something that was to be resisted by every mean possible. Tolkien was not a Luddite. He didn't fear technology. He drove a car and apparently had a lot of fun doing so. However, he did fear that technology would come to be privileged over mankind. And from the Ents to the Scouring of the Shire, there was a resounding message in his works that the kind of thoughtless industrialization propelled by war is nothing but destructive to the human spirit. Tolkien said of the Second World War, "Well, the First War of the Machines seems to be drawing to its final, inconclusive chapter, leaving, alas, everyone the poorer, many bereaved or maimed, and millions dead, and the only one thing triumphant, the machines." Although it's not as literal as the Versailles or the Georgette of Hemingway, the war trickles through Middle-earth's landscape in uncountable ways. Tolkien finds spots of beauty amidst the bleak world of Middle-earth, just as soldiers would stumble into forested groves or fields of poppies and be reminded of what it was to live during the First World War. Mordor is a burnt and scoured land, made sterile by the omnipresence of violence, just as No Man's Land was a place where nothing could live. Even Tolkien admitted that the Dead Marshes were inspired by the sheer excess of death that he witnessed on the front. Frodo and Sam stumble across the ancient preserved corpses and are both horrified and hypnotized. Frodo describes seeing the bodies in the pools when the candles were lit. They lie in all the pools, pale faces deep, deep under dark water. I saw them, grim faces and evil, and noble faces and sad. Yes, yes, said Gollum, all dead, all rotten, elves and men and orcs. The Dead Marshes. Scenes and places like this lay bare the indiscriminate, dehumanizing nature of mass war. The chaos of battle has long passed, but when the smoke dissipates, it all seems such a waste. Victory or loss has become irrelevant. No matter who won the war, no matter whose cause was more just, they all now lay there, still and silent, elves and men right alongside orcs. The force of evil in Middle-earth is oppressive, and its impact is eerily similar to the effect of war seen in All Quiet on the Western Front. The people who fall under evil's grasp lose their humanity. They become like Theoden, wasting away in silence as his kingdom falls. They become like Gollum, slavering and raving, desperate for whatever small comforts he can find. They become like Frodo, losing his memory of the past and his hope for the future, locked into the utterly helpless present. When the effect of the ring has reached its zenith, Frodo admits, "No taste of food, no feel of water, no sound of wind, no memory of tree or grass or flower, no image of moon or star are left to me." There was a very specific kind of pain that Tolkien and his peers underwent. It wasn't just a physical pain, it was a kind of spiritual one. Evil seemed like such a true and real force in their world, and no one had any way of helping them, because how can you ever really truly feel and understand someone else's pain? That is a level of empathy that is very difficult to reach. But by mirroring his generation's experiences into the world of fantasy, Tolkien was able to make at least somewhat accessible the agonies that were so impossible to describe on literal terms. And Tolkien knew better than anyone that simply ending the war was not the way that you ended this pain. Despite the unequivocally joyful and victorious conclusion of The Lord of the Rings, there are pains that linger, especially for the character of Frodo. He was the one under the greatest pressure, and neither victory nor peace can heal him once the dust settles. His mind is troubled. He has entire days of mental disconnection from his friends. He seems to have amnesia. He has moods that follow no reason. His wounds, although long technically healed, continue to pain him years later. He is eventually able to go home to the Shire, but as Paul Baumer feared and Jake had realized, for some people, home is no longer. Frodo admits, "There is no real going back. Though I may come to the Shire, it will not seem the same, for I shall not be the same. I am wounded with knife, sting, and tooth, and a long burden. Where shall I find rest?" Gandalf did not answer. And maybe, as it turns out, there is no answer. Although Sam and Merry and Pippin are able to integrate back into society, Frodo never is. The others say that returning home feels like waking up from a dream, but Frodo says it's like he's falling asleep again. He's caught up in the undertow of the past, such that even the present feels like agony, and the future has been left inconceivable. And perhaps the saddest part of this is how little anyone understands what Frodo's going through. His friends try, but it's said that few people in the Shire knew of his deeds and adventures, and that no one even really wanted to know. He has no chance to recount his stories, to remove them from their traumatizing context. He's left to languish away in his grief, unable to be helped even by his closest friends. If his is not a case of profound traumatic stress disorder, I don't know what is. Research into post-traumatic stress disorder and shell shock was only just beginning at the close of the First World War, but Tolkien did not need a formal diagnosis to understand the way that it could ruin a person. Before they even had the words for it, Tolkien saw firsthand how many survivors never really left the trenches. The War of the Ring is not an allegory for the First World War, but I think that it does carry some of its weight. Middle-earth probably still would have existed if Tolkien had not been at the Somme, but I don't think that it would have been the same. And nowhere is this clearer than in the very particular ways in which The Lord of the Rings finds joy amidst the suffering. When the power of Sauron at last dissipates, It does so as smoke on the wind, an image that undoubtedly would have been very familiar to a soldier of the trenches. This story doesn't end in a snap, that suddenly the world is saved. It infamously ends in stages. It is the gradual release of a long-held breath, loose ends mended and tucked away one by one, just as armistice hardly ended the war entirely. And despite his agony, Frodo is granted the kind of respite that any soldier could hope for. He is allowed to pass, deathless, into eternal peace, at last come to terms with his sacrifice. He tells Sam, "I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. It must often be so, Sam, when things are in danger. Someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them." Now, this is not a practical solution for the real people that felt the way that Frodo did, and Tolkien knew that, but he also wrote aspirationally. He believed firmly that the world was good, and that at the end of it all, even if death was coming for us, we should have hope for salvation. Tolkien had seen the depths of depravity that humans were capable of, and he refused to let that be the end of the story. He was the kind of person that thought that there could be meaning in everything, and he was determined to find what that meaning was. He knew that the face of war had changed drastically from the way that it once had been, and he wanted, or rather needed, to find meaning within that. The old heroic mode, the soldiers and knights and chivalry and pride, died when the first tank rolled across the Western Front. But instead of abandoning the concept of the hero entirely, Tolkien fought to find a new model for this era, and that hero was the Hobbit. Hobbits are not optimists, per se. In fact, they readily acknowledge that death and defeat are perfectly likely outcomes of their endeavors, but they seem to have a sort of inbuilt understanding that sometimes you just have to be willing to let yourself be a part of a story. And sometimes, for them, that's enough to push you forward, even unwillingly, into greatness. Frodo and Sam talk about this, about the grand story that may one day be told about them, and Frodo says, "You and I, Sam, are still stuck in the worst places of the story, and it is all too likely that some will say at this point, 'Shut the book now, Dad, we don't want to read anymore.'" "Maybe," said Sam, "but I wouldn't be one to say that. Things done and over and made into part of the great tales are different." Some of the most vocal critics of the very ironic kind of Lost Generation literature were members of the generation itself. We as humans have a tendency to see the bad before the good. And it's a survival mechanism, it makes sense. And so obviously when we look back at the First World War and its terrible fallout, it's fair to see it as an awful thing. But that misses out on the way that many people who were in the Lost Generation, many people who fought in the war, were thinking much more like Samwise Gamgee. Their story was dark and terrible, but they pushed forward with the knowledge, or at least the hope, that things that are a part of the great tales are different. That in the end, it will be worth it. As much as the Lost Generation had been scarred by their experiences in the war and in the post-war years, for many of them, the First World War was the best, or at least the most significant event of their lives. And even the works of Remarque and Hemingway cannot deny that this was an aspect of the way that they were feeling. In All Quiet on the Western Front, amidst the agony and noise and chaos, an ephemeral moment of beauty surfaces. Suddenly, a surprising warmth comes over me. Those voices, those few soft words, those footsteps in the trenches behind me tear me with a jolt away from the terrible feeling of isolation that goes with the fear of death, to which I nearly succumbed. Those voices mean more to me than my life, more than mothering and fear. They are the strongest and most protective thing there is. They are the voices of my pals. I'm no longer a shivering scrap of humanity alone in the dark. I belong to them, and they to me, and we all share in the same fear and the same life, and we are bound to each other in a strong and simple way. I want to press my face into them, those voices, those few words that saved me, and which will be my support. This sharing of fear, this sense of unity, although driven by terrible circumstances, is undeniably a kind of wonderful thing. In The Sun Also Rises, Jake and his friend spend some time in the wilderness together fishing, and before they part, his friend says of their time together, "Really, you don't know how much it means. I've not had much fun since the war." In Peter Jackson's masterful documentary, They Shall Not Grow Old, first-hand accounts from actual World War I veterans are shockingly nostalgic about the whole thing. Despite the brutality that they lived through, despite the loss, these veterans say that it was the best time that they had in their lives. Many of them look back fondly on their time in the trenches. And while you can say that the passage of time and nostalgia play a significant role there, and unresolved trauma can manifest in some weird ways and change the way we remember things, the fact is that at least some members of the lost generation did not recall their youth as universally dreadful. They believe that there was sunlight peeking through the clouds, and perhaps the clouds were rendered all the more bright for it. Out of all of the works that I've discussed in this video, I think that The Lord of the Rings does the best job of capturing the full nuance of the author's generation's experience. The Lord of the Rings is not hiding behind irony or weaponizing realism. It is, in fact, fantasy. It's non-allegorical. It doesn't even take place in our world, and yet Tolkien proves that this makes no difference when it comes to communicating things that the author felt to be true. The Sun Also Rises is a historical snapshot with far-reaching themes, but one that is in a particular historical context. All Quiet on the Western Front is a significant novel that should be read by everyone, but it will likewise be bound to that historical context and the memory of the specific war it's referencing. But The Lord of the Rings takes the isolated, private experiences of Tolkien's generation, and it universalizes it. He made these feelings really accessible for all generations to come, and the applicability of this story ranges across time and space. Now, I will say that I am a little bit biased towards The Lord of the Rings. To no one's surprise, this is the Jess of the Shire channel, and I do think that fantasy does a really good job of universalizing these kinds of ideas. But all three of these works capture very important facets of the Lost Generation's experience. And what's even more cool is how you can see how these ideas developed over time. Ernest Hemingway was writing just about 10 years after the war. Maria Remarque was writing 15 years or so after the war, and Tolkien was writing decades after the war. And I think that you can see how time and processing changed the way that they perceived these things. These three authors, although utterly different in their approaches, were attempting to all do the same thing. They were trying to figure out what had happened to them, who they were, and who it is that they might become. And none of these authors give exact answers, really, but I think that they were able to find community with each other and with every generation to come through the sharing of these stories. These men are dead, their generation is gone, but their stories remain, and we cannot let them be forgotten. In the wake of the Second World War, Tolkien observed, "So short is human memory, and so evanescent are its generations, that in only about 30 years there will be few or no people with that direct experience which alone goes really to the heart. The burnt hand teaches most about fire." Tolkien was worried that we would forget the cost of war. He was worried that the plight of his generation would be forgotten, and this would all be repeated, and so many lives would be wasted to learn a lesson that we should have already learned. So I beg you not to forget. These authors wrestled their complex, frightful, beautiful life experiences into stories for the purpose of reminding us not to repeat their failures, to urge us away from hateful pride, and to encourage us to do better. And I really, really hope that we can. There are a lot of really important stories from this generation beyond those written by these three men that I have mentioned. Vera Britton's Testament of Youth or Claude McKay's Home to Harlem are excellent reading if you want to round out your perspective a bit. I think that generational studies are a very fascinating field because you're trying to generalize something as nuanced and varied as the human experience. Obviously, these generations are not a monolith, and 3 books written by 3 people from that generation will never be able to capture the full breadth of the experience. So I encourage you to read around a bit. Suggest some alternate reading from this general time period in the comments if you like. My sources are also linked in the description if you want to look more into the specific avenues that I chose to research. It's a long, long bibliography though, so I will be bolding a couple of the ones that I pulled a little bit more from. But in very positive news, if this video has got you longing for the English countryside like me, allow me to tell you a little bit about this year's UK Brandywine Festival. That is right, on top of the Brandywine Festival in Kentucky, which I will also be attending, this 5-day Hobbit live-action roleplay will now be at Weston Park in Staffordshire from September 9th to 13th. I am going to be there, and I am so excited. I literally screamed when I heard about this event. I haven't been back to England in 20 years, and I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to be there. Now, you may remember that I went to last year's Brandywine in Kentucky, and I never made a video about that. And full transparency, that's because I didn't take any footage. I had too much fun. I don't know what to tell you. I took like 2 pictures, but I was just having so much fun putting away my phone, not thinking about work, and living in the moment that I got absolutely no content about it, and I couldn't be happier. I spent my days of Brandywine eating, napping in the sunshine, dancing, listening to music, and meeting new friends. And I think that last year's Brandywine was probably the first time in years that I've felt actually relaxed. And that is why I'm doing it 2 times this year, at the UK one and the Kentucky one. And I'm just so excited to put down my phone and live as a hobbit for a while. If you would like to join me and so many other fantastic hobbits at the Brandywine Festival this year, either festival, I will have links down in the description. And I really hope to get to see you guys there. I met so many wonderful, wonderful hobbits, people that knew my channel and people who had no idea what I was last year, and I think that this year is going to be even better. Be sure to give this video a like because that seriously helps me out, and share it and comment and do all of those things because it helps me get into the algorithm, which really helps the channel out. And also consider subscribing if you want to tune in every week to hear me talk about the kind of stuff that I like to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me this week and every week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.